Hi guys, today we are going to find out, what if satellites were never launched into orbit around Earth? You wake up this morning, stretch your arms, and check your phone for the weather forecast. What you don't realize is that above your head, there's nothing but empty space and silence. No mechanical eyes watching hurricanes form over distant oceans, no metal messengers bouncing your calls across continents. The sky holds only clouds, birds, and the occasional airplane struggling with limited navigation systems. You're living in a world where humanity never figured out how to keep machines spinning overhead. And honestly, you probably won't survive this alternate reality as comfortably as you think you would. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with your location and local time. I'm curious where this alternate journey finds you today. Now, sit back and let's dive into today's alternate journey together. Your morning routine feels normal enough, but outside your window, the world operates on fundamentally different rules. Weather services rely entirely on ground-based radar stations and weather balloons that drift unpredictably through the atmosphere. The morning news anchor delivers the weather forecast with an apologetic shrug and admits uncertainty about conditions beyond 50 miles. Hurricane season becomes a terrifying guessing game as meteorologists track storms only when they're already approaching coastlines. You watch families evacuate based on radio reports from ship captains who happen to encounter the storm at sea. Weather balloons launched twice daily provide snapshots of atmospheric conditions, but they drift wherever winds carry them. Ground-based radar systems create a patchwork of coverage with massive blind spots over oceans and remote areas. Farmers plant crops without knowing if drought or flooding approaches from regions beyond their local weather stations. Airlines cancel flights not because storms are confirmed, but because they simply can't know what lies ahead. Mountain communities remain cut off for days when unexpected blizzards strike without satellite early warning systems. Tornado Alley residents receive minutes rather than hours of advance notice as storms develop faster than ground systems detect. Coastal cities experience storm surge flooding because oceanographic monitoring relies on scattered buoy networks and coastal observers. International weather cooperation becomes nearly impossible without orbital platforms to track global atmospheric patterns. You realize that predicting tomorrow's weather requires an intricate dance of educated guesswork and prayer. Ships crossing the Atlantic navigate by sextant and stars, just as their ancestors did centuries before. Ocean vessels carry massive radio equipment to maintain contact with coastal stations within limited range boundaries. You watch cargo ships disappear beyond the horizon, entering communication dead zones that stretch for thousands of miles. Commercial airlines follow predetermined flight corridors, unable to optimize routes based on real-time weather or traffic data. Pilots rely on ground-based radio beacons that create narrow navigation highways through otherwise trackless skies. International flights require fuel stops at remote islands to maintain communication links and navigation accuracy. Emergency situations at sea become deadly isolation scenarios when ships drift beyond radio contact with rescue services. Aircraft crossing polar regions follow dangerous routes close to magnetic compass interference without GPS backup systems. Fishing fleets venture into familiar waters only, unable to track migrating schools or identify optimal fishing locations. Maritime rescue operations depend on chance encounters with other vessels or coastal watchers spotting distress signals. Air traffic controllers manage flights through voice communication alone, creating bottlenecks at major airports worldwide. Navigation errors accumulate over long distances as dead reckoning replaces precise satellite positioning for global transportation. Massive relay towers stretch across continents like steel forests, carrying telephone signals from city to city. Long-distance calls require operators to manually connect circuits through dozens of intermediate switching stations. You witness the construction of towering microwave relay stations every 30 miles along major communication routes. International phone calls become expensive luxuries as signals must traverse multiple countries through physical infrastructure chains. Remote areas remain completely cut off from telephone networks because extending tower lines proves economically impossible. Business people plan meetings weeks in advance since confirming international calls requires scheduling through multiple operators. The landscape transforms as utility companies erect increasingly tall towers to beam signals over mountains and valleys. Communication blackouts occur when storms damage relay towers, severing contact between entire regions for days. Rural communities organize around single telephone exchanges that connect them to the outside world through fragile tower networks. Military communications depend on elaborate ground-based systems vulnerable to sabotage and natural disasters. Cross-continental business deals slow to a crawl as complex negotiations require days rather than minutes to coordinate. Engineers design increasingly sophisticated ground networks, but they remain earthbound and susceptible to physical interruption. Television broadcasts reach only audiences within direct line of sight of massive terrestrial transmitters. You live in a world where watching foreign news requires traveling to border regions or waiting for filmed reports. Cable television networks become the dominant force, snaking underground lines to every neighborhood and building. Remote mountain communities exist in complete media isolation, receiving no television signals whatsoever. International broadcasting relies on powerful shortwave radio transmissions that fade and crackle with atmospheric interference. Television programming remains intensely regional as networks cannot economically reach distant audiences without satellite distribution. Live global events become impossible to witness simultaneously as video feeds require physical transportation across continents. News agencies employ fleets of aircraft to deliver filmed footage between countries for delayed broadcast. Sports fans in different regions watch major events days or weeks after they occur through delayed transmission. Educational television programs cannot reach underserved populations in developing nations without extensive infrastructure investment. Emergency broadcasting systems cover only local areas, leaving distant communities uninformed during national crises. Television advertising markets remain fragmented as companies cannot reach national audiences through unified broadcast networks. Military operations unfold without GPS precision as soldiers navigate using paper maps and magnetic compasses. Artillery strikes require multiple observer teams positioned at known coordinates to achieve acceptable accuracy. You witness naval fleets operating in formation through visual signals and radio communication alone. Air forces conduct bombing missions using landmark navigation and dead reckoning calculations prone to significant error. Submarine warfare becomes even more dangerous as underwater vessels lose contact for weeks during patrol missions. Ground-based radar networks create defensive perimeters, but leave vast gaps that enemy aircraft exploit. Military logistics depend on predetermined supply routes since real-time tracking of units proves impossible. Special forces operations in hostile territory carry extreme risks without satellite communication backup. Intelligence gathering relies heavily on human agents and reconnaissance aircraft, rather than orbital surveillance platforms. Nuclear deterrence strategies adjust to account for less precise missile guidance systems and targeting capabilities. International military cooperation suffers as forces cannot coordinate effectively across vast distances. Combat search and rescue missions depend on visual spotting and radio triangulation with limited success rates. The internet develops slowly through undersea cable networks and fiber optic lines spanning continents. Global connectivity requires massive infrastructure investments as every connection needs physical cables. You experience internet outages lasting weeks when undersea cables break from ship anchors or earthquakes. Remote regions remain digitally isolated since extending fiber networks to sparse populations proves economically unfeasible. International data transmission costs remain expensive as bandwidth depends on limited cable capacity. Internet service providers focus on dense urban areas, while rural communities receive dial-up speeds at best. Redundancy becomes critical as single cable breaks can isolate entire countries from global networks. Streaming video services emerge much later due to bandwidth limitations on purely terrestrial networks. Online gaming between distant countries suffers from high latency as signals travel through multiple relay points. Cloud computing develops differently with data centers concentrated near major cable landing points. Social media platforms remain regionally focused since global real-time communication proves technically challenging. E-commerce growth stagnates in developing nations without reliable high-speed internet infrastructure. The Cold War space race focuses entirely on manned missions and lunar exploration rather than orbital infrastructure. Both superpowers pour resources into building moon bases and Mars exploration programs instead of satellite networks. You witness spectacular rocket launches aimed at establishing permanent human colonies beyond Earth's atmosphere. Scientific competition centers on who can sustain human life longest in space habitats and planetary outposts. Space technology advances rapidly in life support systems, radiation shielding, and interplanetary transportation. Military space programs develop orbital weapons platforms and manned reconnaissance stations rather than automated systems. International prestige comes from dramatic human achievements in space rather than invisible technological infrastructure. Space agencies recruit astronauts as celebrities and explorers rather than technicians managing robotic systems. Popular culture celebrates heroic space pioneers venturing to distant worlds instead of monitoring Earth from orbit. Economic competition drives development of space manufacturing and asteroid mining operations with human crews. Treaties govern human activities in space while automated satellite deployment never becomes a diplomatic concern. The space industry evolves around supporting human presence rather than developing unmanned orbital services. Natural disasters strike without warning, as early detection systems rely solely on ground-based monitoring stations. Hurricanes form and intensify over open oceans, while coastal populations remain completely unaware of approaching danger. You watch entire cities evacuate only after storms make landfall and cause initial destruction. Earthquake prediction becomes impossible without orbital sensors monitoring tectonic plate movements from space. Volcanic eruptions catch aviation authorities off guard as ash clouds spread unpredictably through flight corridors. Forest fires rage unchecked across wilderness areas before ground spotters or aircraft detect the flames. Tsunami warning systems depend on scattered ocean buoys and coastal observers with limited coverage areas. Drought conditions develop unnoticed until crops fail and water shortages reach critical levels. Flood warnings come too late, as river monitoring stations cannot track rainfall patterns across entire watersheds. Avalanche forecasting relies on local weather stations missing crucial snowpack data from remote mountain regions. Tornado formation goes undetected until the deadly funnels appear directly overhead populated areas. International disaster relief efforts respond slowly without real-time damage assessment from orbital observation. Climate research remains primitive, without orbital platforms continuously monitoring global atmospheric conditions and temperature patterns. Scientists struggle to understand climate change using only ground-based weather stations and occasional balloon measurements. You witness environmental researchers making educated guesses about polar ice cap changes based on limited expedition data. Ocean temperature monitoring depends on scattered research vessels and coastal measurement points, missing vast areas. Atmospheric chemistry studies lack comprehensive data as researchers cannot track greenhouse gas concentrations globally. Deforestation rates remain unknown since aerial surveys require expensive aircraft missions over remote regions. Ozone layer monitoring becomes nearly impossible without instruments capable of measuring stratospheric conditions continuously. Marine biology research suffers as scientists cannot track ocean current changes or marine ecosystem health patterns. Agricultural science develops slowly, without comprehensive data on soil moisture, crop health, and growing conditions. Astronomy advances at a crawl since ground-based telescopes struggle with atmospheric distortion and light pollution. Geological surveys require decades to map mineral resources and understand earthquake fault systems accurately. Environmental protection policies develop based on incomplete data, leading to ineffective conservation strategies worldwide. Air travel becomes significantly more dangerous as pilots navigate without comprehensive weather data or precise positioning systems. Commercial flights follow fixed routes regardless of weather conditions, leading to frequent turbulence and emergency landings. You experience flight delays lasting days when storms block major air corridors with no satellite guidance available. International aviation coordination becomes nearly impossible as air traffic controllers cannot track aircraft beyond radar range. Polar flights remain extremely hazardous due to magnetic compass interference and complete communication blackouts. Emergency aircraft diversions rely on pilot judgment and limited ground-based weather reports from distant airports. Flight planning requires extensive fuel reserves since pilots cannot optimize routes based on real-time wind patterns. Aviation accidents increase dramatically as pilots encounter unexpected weather phenomena without advanced warning systems. Search and rescue operations for missing aircraft depend entirely on visual spotting and last-known position estimates. Airline schedules become unreliable as weather-related cancellations cascade through the system without predictive capabilities. Cargo aviation suffers massive delays as freight cannot be rerouted efficiently around weather systems or airport closures. Aviation insurance costs skyrocket due to increased accident rates and unpredictable weather-related damages. Cartography remains an expensive and time-consuming process as mapmakers rely on aerial photography and ground surveys alone. Remote wilderness areas stay unmapped for decades since accessing them requires dangerous expeditions and specialized equipment. You discover that accurate topographical maps exist only for economically important regions while vast territories remain blank. Ocean floor mapping proceeds at glacial pace using sonar equipment from surface vessels in dangerous waters. Military mapping operations require years of reconnaissance flights over hostile territory to gather basic geographical intelligence. Urban planning suffers as city planners lack comprehensive aerial imagery for development and infrastructure projects. Geological mapping advances slowly since researchers must physically visit every location to collect mineral and soil samples. Navigation charts for maritime and aviation use contain significant errors and outdated information leading to accidents. Archaeological discoveries remain hidden, as researchers cannot survey large areas efficiently for potential excavation sites. Border disputes intensify when neighboring countries disagree about territorial boundaries without precise geographical references. Emergency response planning becomes inadequate as responders lack detailed maps of flood zones and evacuation routes. Natural resource exploration costs multiply as companies must conduct extensive ground surveys before beginning extraction operations. Developing nations remain isolated. Communication islands as extending terrestrial networks across difficult terrain proves prohibitively expensive. Remote villages in mountainous regions and dense jungles never receive telephone service or internet connectivity. You witness entire populations cut off from global information networks, relying on radio broadcasts and traveling messengers. Educational opportunities stagnate in isolated communities without access to distance learning or digital resources. Medical emergencies become death sentences when remote clinics cannot communicate with hospitals or medical specialists. Economic development halts in regions lacking communication infrastructure as businesses cannot coordinate with distant markets. Political movements struggle to organize across national boundaries without reliable international communication channels. Cultural exchange diminishes as isolated populations cannot share ideas, art, or traditions with the wider world. Disaster relief efforts face massive coordination challenges when affected areas lose communication with outside rescue agencies. Scientific research collaborations become impossible between institutions in different countries without reliable data transmission. Migration patterns change as people abandon isolated regions in search of connected communities with modern amenities. National aid organizations cannot effectively monitor or coordinate humanitarian programs in disconnected areas. Emergency services operate with severe limitations as search and rescue teams cannot locate missing persons without GPS coordinates. Lost hikers and stranded travelers face prolonged danger since rescue operations depend on visual searches and radio triangulation. You watch rescue helicopters fly grid patterns for days, searching wilderness areas that satellite systems could scan instantly. Maritime emergencies become deadly waiting games as Coast Guard vessels navigate to distress signals using compass bearings alone. Avalanche rescue operations rely on probe lines and trained dogs, since buried victims cannot transmit precise location data. Forest fire evacuations proceed chaotically, without real-time mapping of fire boundaries and safe evacuation corridors. Earthquake rescue efforts waste precious hours as emergency teams cannot identify collapsed buildings or trapped survivor locations. Medical helicopter services face navigation challenges, reaching remote accident sites without precise positioning information. Flood rescue operations struggle to coordinate as emergency responders cannot assess water levels or identify stranded populations. Missing aircraft searches cover vast ocean areas using visual spotting techniques with extremely low success rates. Emergency communication networks fail frequently as ground-based systems suffer damage from the same disasters they monitor. International rescue coordination becomes nearly impossible without shared positioning systems and real-time status updates. Banking systems develop entirely through physical networks, as financial institutions cannot rely on satellite communication for transactions. International money transfers require days or weeks as funds move through correspondent banking relationships and cable networks. You experience a world where credit card transactions work only within regional networks, limiting travel and commerce. Stock exchanges operate with significant delays as trading information travels through terrestrial communication systems between countries. Automated teller machines remain local services since banks cannot maintain real-time connections across vast distances. Currency exchange rates fluctuate wildly due to delayed information flow between international financial markets. Electronic banking emerges slowly as institutions invest heavily in secure ground-based communication infrastructure. Remote areas rely entirely on cash transactions since digital payment systems cannot reach isolated communities. Financial fraud detection becomes primitive without real-time transaction monitoring across global networks. International business deals require physical document transportation and face-to-face meetings for contract verification. Investment decisions suffer from outdated market information as financial data travels slowly between trading centers. Economic crises spread unpredictably as financial institutions cannot coordinate responses or share critical information instantly. Mobile phones emerged decades later as cellular technology developed solely through tower-based networks with limited coverage. Cell phone service exists only in densely populated urban areas where companies can justify expensive tower construction costs. You carry a mobile phone that works perfectly downtown but becomes useless the moment you leave city limits. Rural communities remain completely cut off from mobile communication as tower networks cannot economically serve sparse populations. International roaming becomes impossible since cellular networks cannot coordinate across national boundaries without satellite links. Mobile internet speeds remain extremely slow as data transmission relies entirely on terrestrial tower-to-tower connections. Cellular dead zones persist even in major cities due to geographical obstacles and the limitations of ground-based signals. Emergency mobile calls fail frequently in remote areas where people most desperately need communication access. Mobile phone batteries last longer since devices don't constantly search for distant satellite connections or GPS signals. Text messaging develops differently as a purely local communication method within individual cellular tower coverage areas. Smartphone technology advances more slowly without satellite-dependent features like GPS navigation and global internet access. Mobile communication costs remain high as cellular companies invest heavily in extensive ground infrastructure networks. Today's smartphone-dependent world struggles with fundamental infrastructure limitations as GPS navigation simply doesn't exist. Ride-sharing services like Uber never develop since drivers cannot locate passengers or optimize routes automatically. You live in a reality where getting lost remains a genuine concern every time you venture into unfamiliar territory. Food delivery apps become impossible as restaurants cannot coordinate with drivers lacking precise location capabilities. Social media check-ins disappear entirely since applications cannot determine or share user locations automatically. Fitness tracking loses crucial features as devices cannot measure distance, pace, or route information accurately. Dating apps operate without location matching, forcing people to specify neighborhoods manually when seeking nearby connections. Emergency services struggle to locate callers who cannot provide exact addresses during crisis situations. Weather apps provide only general regional forecasts since they cannot access hyperlocal conditions based on user location. Navigation becomes an art form again as people rediscover paper maps, landmarks, and asking strangers for directions. Photography loses automatic geotagging capabilities as cameras cannot embed location data into images for organization. Modern logistics industries collapse as delivery companies cannot track packages or optimize shipping routes efficiently. Humanity adapts to Earth-bound solutions while missing countless orbital advantages we take for granted in our satellite-enabled world. Scientific advancement slows dramatically as researchers cannot monitor global phenomena or coordinate international studies effectively. You witness a civilization that develops impressive ground-based technologies but remains fundamentally limited to terrestrial perspectives. Economic growth stagnates in developing regions as communication barriers prevent integration into global markets and supply chains. Environmental challenges multiply as climate change accelerates without comprehensive monitoring systems to guide policy responses. Technological innovation follows different paths as engineers focus on improving terrestrial networks rather than developing space-based solutions. Cultural exchange diminishes as isolated populations cannot easily share ideas, languages, and traditions across vast distances. Military conflicts become more unpredictable as nations operate without precise intelligence gathering and communication capabilities. Disaster response remains primitive as emergency services lack real-time information about developing crises and affected populations. The digital divide becomes an unbridgeable chasm separating connected urban centers from isolated rural communities worldwide. Transportation safety suffers as navigation errors and weather surprises continue causing preventable accidents across all modes of travel. This alternate Earth develops as a collection of connected islands rather than a truly integrated global civilization. As we reach the end of this alternate journey, you begin to grasp the invisible threads that hold our modern world together. Every time you check your phone for directions, stream a video, or make an international call, satellites work silently overhead. The weather forecast that helps you plan your weekend depends on mechanical eyes watching storms form across distant oceans. Your GPS navigation system relies on a constellation of satellites that would never exist in this alternate timeline. Without these orbital guardians, humanity would face a fundamentally different set of challenges and opportunities. Perhaps we would develop stronger local communities, more resilient communication networks, or better ground-based technologies. Or maybe we would remain forever fragmented, struggling with the basic connectivity that makes our global civilization possible. The satellites spinning silently above us right now represent one of humanity's greatest achievements in international cooperation. They remind us that sometimes the most important infrastructure is the kind we never see or think about. So the next time you effortlessly navigate to a new restaurant or video chat with friends across the globe, remember the alternate Earth where none of that would be possible. What aspect of our satellite-dependent world do you think you'd miss most if they suddenly disappeared tomorrow?